The crisis of neoliberalism inaugurated the 21st century. The Bush administration, following the 2001 terror attacks on the economic hub, the World Trade Center, expanded the US government's role as world police, both abroad and at home, through its war on terror. Far from delivering change from the Bush presidency, the elected Obama-Biden ticket was the continuity and expansion in managing the political and economic crisis of neoliberalism, further seen in his response to the bailout of the banks responsible for the 2008 recession. The twin populist insurgencies of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 seized upon the resulting discontent and expressed a crisis within the established political parties. Sanders sought to counter neoliberalism with a return to New Deal-style management of the state, but the Democrats ended up with Joe Biden, whose Inflation Reduction Act failed to translate into new political vision for the Democratic Party. Trump, in contrast, appears to have reshaped the Republican Party into a vehicle for a capitalist class to broker a better deal for the workers, make America great again. The present moment recalls the emergence of neoliberalism through the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Against the crisis of the Fordist state capitalism, the Reagan administration appropriated the so-called neoliberal thinkers such as Hayek and Friedman, who championed Adam Smith's vision of civil social cooperation and freedom of workers and enterprise against the Fordist state capitalism. The crisis of the Fordist state capitalism, however, did not so much readily translate into political tasks for the left. Some on the left understood neoliberalism to be continuous with the post-war Fordist state, for example, Ernest Mandel's conception of late capitalism, and David Harvey's idea of post-Fordism. The movement of labor and capital was still administered by the Fordist state. Distinctively, others on the left have opposed neoliberalism for over a generation through a defense of the post-war welfare state, through appeals to anti-austerity and anti-globalization. Regardless of these self-understandings, the growing discontent with neoliberalism is giving rise to political realignment, demonstrating that capitalism remains a political problem of the economic organization of society without having the ability to overcome its crisis. Does the 2024 election express the workers' desire to fulfill the gainsaying promises made in the 1980s? And have new political promises tasked the left in a way that needs reconfiguration from the past? The 20th century began with the crisis of Marxism, whose political task of overcoming capitalism was subsequently never realized. In the shadow of the millennial left's attempt to intervene in their generation's greatest crisis by reaching into the fundamental struggles of the old left, has it deemed Marxism necessary and able to show the way forward in the 21st century?
If you want to think about neoliberalism, you should think about liberalism. Right? So, if neoliberalism is the revival of something, right? Anything that's neo is that, right? If they're making a remake of Evil Dead, right? Then you can't really talk about that without talking about the original. So I have been going through teaching the third version I have of a class on Marx's Capital, and a lot of that book is concerned with the thing that's being revived by neoliberalism, which is liberalism 1.0 in the relevant sense, which is not, social liberalism or, technocratic liberalism, any of the sort of senses of liberalism that people often have in mind when they use that word, but it's, economic liberalism, as in laissez-faire, right? That's roughly what people are talking about in a specific sense, which we can get into. So, much of Capital is Marx talking about working conditions, about workers being forced to work, 12, 14, 15, 16 hours a day in conditions of sort of petty workplace tyranny, rampant injury. There's a whole digression in chapter 10 about people, spending their paltry wages on bread that was mixed with sawdust. So it could be sold more cheaply, right? That's what we're talking about, right? When we're talking about economic liberalism. Conversely, a lot of people who think they're Marxists have this sort of reflexive dislike of reformism, but Marx sees the factory acts that curb some of that stuff as this enormous victory in the class struggle. At the end of chapter 10, right, he calls, Factory Act limiting the workday to 10 hours a day. So this was a great victory at the time, that you only have to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, 60-hour work week, as calls that the Magna Carta of the working class. And to a great extent, that book is, the heroes of that book are often these factory inspectors who were enforcing the Factory Acts, right? They're pretty much the only people who are quoted in Capital, who are quoted in a positive way, are like Aristotle, Engels, earlier Marx when he's quoted himself, and a bunch of factory inspectors, right? And so I think roughly, if you think about the rise of the workers' movement and the regulatory state, which, in all of its sort of twists and turns, which in other countries that, that had much stronger workers' movements than the US ever did, took the form of, governments by socialist parties, or, popular fronts that might even include communist parties. But in the US, the sort of very, pale version of that we had was roughly the New Deal and the Great Society. And very roughly what people mean by neoliberalism in the original sense is the counteroffensive against all of that, right? That really starts with the recently deceased Jimmy Carter at the end of the 70s, who's sort of seen as such a benevolent figure after he left office that that even people whose politics would lead them to hate all this stuff tend to forget his role in getting the ball rolling. Before going into overdrive in the Reagan years, and the Reagan-Bush years before the baton is passed to Bill Clinton in the 90s, right? Who is, certainly not a liberal in the sense of being like a New Deal liberal, and not even particularly socially liberal, right?
He black people liked him.
Right? Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. He went on Arsenio Hall, right? There's
MTV liked him.
MTV.
The pop culture phenomenon, would you say?
Yeah, there you go.
The Donald Trump of his time, would you say?
In some ways, actually.
Is anyone here old enough to remember Bill Clinton when he was running for president?
Playing the saxophone?
Anyone?
Yeah, I am. I actually, look, I was born in 1980. I can remember.
Young man.
I remember being, like 11, 12 and listening to Arsenio Hall on my radio.
Oh, dude, my grandma thought Bill Clinton was the bee's knees.
Yeah, people call him the first black president, which is
Toni Morrison.
Yes, Toni Morrison called it that, right? But of course, he gave us the Defense of Marriage Act. He had oftentimes, don't ask, don't tell. Oftentimes, since people will, I think, often be far too quick to link the issue of neoliberalism to immigration in a way that suggests that, looser border policies are sort of part of the neoliberal package. That's part of the narrative when people see Trump as turning away from it. The biggest leap forward in harshness of immigration restrictions was in the 1990s.
Bill Clinton starts building that wall that you have up there.
Yeah, Bill Clinton gave us the, essentially the reason why we have a two-tier justice system for immigrants and everybody else, that makes it much harder to legally contest deportations, et cetera. That was all Bill Clinton. Also, by the way, as far as complicating the way that people say neoliberalism, Ronald Reagan way more of a protectionist about trade than anybody remembers right now. So I think that the stuff about protectionism, about borders, I think these are somewhat secondary issues. I think the main thing that we talk about neoliberalism, is not liberalizing trade per se, right? There's certainly plenty of that, but it's not that. It's certainly not liberalizing borders necessarily. In fact, if you look at the sort of EU becoming fortress Europe, at the same time, right, as they are enforcing all sorts of internally neoliberal economic policies, those two issues really come apart. So it seems to me that what we're really talking about is the long counteroffensive against the gains for the working class that are embodied in the regulatory state, which brings us to Donald Trump. Because sorry, I just I want to make sure I'm not overstepping my time. Just checking how I'm doing. But it does bring us to Donald Trump, because the prompt that the version that we just heard read included this phrase about Donald Trump and MAGA being this way the Republican Party could broker a better deal for workers, and I really don't know what that means. If anything, I think taken seriously, right? Certainly as far as domestic economic policy. What we saw to some extent with Trump round 1 and what we're seeing like crazy with Trump round 2 is this dramatic acceleration of the neoliberal war against the workers' movement and the regulatory state. In his first term, Trump did the things that any Republican president would have done, the things that George W. Bush certainly did, the things that Mitt Romney would have done, right? He filled the National Labor Relations Board with hardcore union busters who took every opportunity to make it harder to organize a union, easier to fire people, etc. Right? In fact, there was a New York Times story in January 2021 about Trump officials taking their last moments in office to seize the opportunity to weaken safety regulations for long distance truckers, right? That was the kind of thing that was going on. Even the promise of some sort of better deal for workers through protectionism was largely nonsense. The Trump replacement for NAFTA was much more like NAFTA than it was like not NAFTA. There were some provisions that involved token improvements, but they're basically unenforceable. The biggest changes have to do with harsher crackdowns on intellectual property violations. And so that was round 1. Round 2, the Trump administration is waging a scorched earth war against organized labor.
Very strategic this time around.
Going way beyond what they did last time, right? So, most attention has been focused on, stuff like USAID because of the intra-ruling class battle about that. And to some extent, the Trump and the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, destroying the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which, I don't know how that fits into the dynamic described in an earlier version of the prompt about the state and civil society, which I don't consider particularly useful analytical categories. But, the effect of this is to make it easier for credit card companies to rip people off with junk fees and harder to hold them to account. But what's missed in all of this, right, is I think by far the most important, certainly is if you want to sort of raise strategic questions about the prospects for building any kind of actual left in the United States, which we don't really have right now, that is going to be rooted in organized workers, or it's not going to be meaningful, or it's just going to be people giving conference panels at universities and doing study groups, right? Those are your options, right? You can recreate the Green Party with more socialist branding if you'd like, right? It's not going to do anybody any good, but if that's what you'd like to do, you can do that, right? If you want to have any sort of left that has any chance of having any meaningful impact on American politics, it would have to be rooted in organized workers. And this time around, right, what has Trump done just in the few weeks that he's been in office, right? He illegally fired a Gwynne Wilcox, member of the National Labor Relations Board. Law cannot possibly be clearer that he can't do that. Many people who claim to care about the Constitution don't care about this. And the effect of that is to bring the board below quorum, so they're not allowed to make board decisions because they're below quorum because this illegal firing. Meanwhile, richest man in the world, Elon Musk, has, through his company SpaceX, filed a constitutional challenge to the basic enforcement powers of the NLRB, which they're not able to fight in court because they're below quorum, which means that we may very soon be facing a world where we essentially don't have an NLRB, which, if you want to be the least serious possible kind of Marxist intellectual, you could say, oh, well, that's actually good because see this regulatory framework held back this wave of worker militancy that we were surely going to have if we didn't have the NLRB. If you want to live in the real world, this means that it's going to be far, far easier to intimidate workers out of trying to band together and organize for any kind of rights or protection. at the workplace. That if you get fired for trying to organize a union in a world without the NLRB, maybe you can go through the regular court system in 5 years, 10 years. It's possible that you'll get your job back. Meanwhile, I don't know how you and your family are going to survive that time, and anybody else who's considering stepping out of line in your workplace has seen what will happen and learned their lesson. They're going to keep their head down. So that strikes me as, in every way, in the ways that matter most, as neoliberalism in overdrive. I think that this is often lost because when people make entirely correct statements like, oh, Clinton and Obama represented a neoliberal turn in the Democratic Party, completely correct thing to say. But that gets telephone gamed into just sort of seeing neoliberal as a synonym for Democrat who really sucks, which is unhelpful. Doesn't help us understand what we're up against, certainly doesn't help us understand how to even think about fighting it, never mind fighting it. And with that, I think I'm done.
Take it away, Jason.
What he said.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.